Welcome to the Book Corner, where we hear from authors shaping management thinking today. My name is Jyoti Guptara, and I'm the author of Business Storytelling from Hype to Hack. In business, we like to rely on tried and tested formulas. But what when the models fail us? Our next guest argues that in many areas, traditional business thinking is precisely what has been preventing effective management. Joining us now is renowned strategist and best-selling author Roger Martin.
Thank you for having me. This is a great pleasure.
Great honor to have you on the show. Roger Martin was in 2017 named the world's #1 management thinker by Thinkers 50, and I believe you've only gotten better since, Roger.
I hope so. I hope I've aged like a fine wine.
I'm sure you are indeed. In fact, I was researching for our conversation, and I came across somebody who described you as the best strategy genius of all time. This was an anonymous reviewer on Amazon talking about your new book, A New Way to Think. But you know, people like Roger Martin know a lot of famous people, a lot of influential business people, so having their endorsement is one thing, but having anonymous reviewers on Amazon appreciate you speaks volumes too.
It's better than the opposite.
Now, Roger, you start in this, your new book, with a mention of Peter Drucker. And I don't believe you did that just to get invited to this year's Drucker Forum, because you've been a long-time friend of the forum. We just watched a segment, I believe, from 2014, where you were sharing with us. So why single out Peter Drucker?
Well, he is my favorite management thinker of all time. That would be one reason. And he's also a real kind of inspiration to me. What I saw Peter Drucker doing throughout his career is looking at the world and saying the way we think about this aspect of management doesn't work, doesn't get us what we want, so here's another way to think about it. And I draw inspiration from that. I also draw patience, because many of the things he said at the time, people were like, what is he talking about? You know, you should manage by objectives. What's this newfangled notion? Fast forward 25 years, and it's considered the only way to manage. So he gives me patience when I put something out into the world, and the reaction is not immediately, oh, that's great, Roger, we should change everything we do. I say, well, it might take 25 years.
We could all do with some more patience.
Yes, yes.
And you mentioned not getting expected results, which leads me to my next question, and indeed the core thesis of your book.
Yes.
In your experience, you found that many of these conventional models haven't been working, and so you did the only sensible thing, really, and you came up with your own models, which have evidently been working a lot better. And yet, in your experience, how do most executives or managers respond when their favorite model isn't working?
They do it harder, right? They say, in my view, incentive compensation, the way it's structured, doesn't create the kind of performance that people wish. And so they say, oh, we didn't give them enough incentive compensation. Oh, it should have been, restricted shares rather than options. They tend to double down on the existing one, and often, in essence, blame themselves. I didn't do it right. If I had only done it right, the model would have worked. So it's a long process, typically, of them finally giving up and saying, I'd be open to another way of thinking about this.
So having a new way to think is good news, because it frees us from a lot of self-condemnation and questioning.
Yes, it does. I mean, that was the purpose of the book, to say to people who were seeing something that they were taught perhaps in business school, or their organization says this is de rigueur, the way we do things, to give those people a way of saying to both themselves and to those around them in their organization, well, there might be a reason why this isn't working so well, and here's a different way to do it. I always want to provide a practical way to do what I'm suggesting. If I say just be smarter, just grow taller, right? That's not going to help anybody. I have to give advice that is practical enough and concrete enough for them to do something with it.
Makes me think of one of my favorite titles of all time that we've had at a Drucker Forum, namely Slaying Zombie Ideas. Roger, why do these outdated models that evidently don't work, many of which most of the time, why are they so hard to kill?
Well, it's because people rally around them. I mean, I'm a big fan of Structure of Scientific Revolutions, the Kuhn book, where he says, the path of understanding and the path of science over time is that people study an issue and they come with a theory that gains momentum and becomes the dominant theory. And then the people who are all invested in that theory because they do their research in that theory, et cetera, essentially attack anybody who says, maybe it isn't working, maybe there's another way. So there's this, and I think Kuhn is just right. That is the way the world works. People rally around it and have their stakes in that theory, and they don't want anybody to say this doesn't work. Like compensation consultants don't like me much. Why? It's because they make huge amounts of money on structuring incentive compensation schemes. Oh, you should give them this much in short term and this in long term, and it should be this amount of restricted stock and should be this amount of options, and then they send them a big bill for that. They don't like me saying all of that doesn't work.
So there
flat
are
out.
Politics involved, and
Yes.
It was quite a meta example you just brought, because you were talking about people who teach incentives and how they're being incentivized.
right.
So in your book, A New Way to Think, you go into many different models and in several categories. Of course, strategy is one of the focuses. But when someone reads your book, let's say they're convinced, or
Yes.
even by the segment, where do they start? Because you go through so many models. Where would you say they get the most traction early on so that they could try other models?
Well, I sort of see it a little bit almost like a recipe book, right? You don't go into a recipe book and say, I'm going to cook them all. You say, I want to make a different new dessert that I've never tried before. You go to the dessert section and read that. It would be similar in this book. I would say, go to the chapter headings and say, what's an area that I'm unsatisfied with, and just read that. It's my only book of this sort. I mean, it's my 13th book, the only one that doesn't follow a narrative from the start to the finish. It's thematic, and I set that up as, models that don't work, and here's a different model. But then it's 14 different models from different domains. And so I would just start with the domain that you are kind of struggling with, right? If you're struggling with culture, go to the culture chapter. If you're struggling with compensation, go to that chapter.
Very practical response, Roger, and I love how practical your book is and how straightforward you make things. You mentioned the word narrative earlier,
Yes.
so that let's talk about strategy. A lot of people have this idea that strategy is very data-driven. They would like what they call a scientific approach.
Yes.
And you talk about the importance of imagination, and you go so far as to call strategic options stories.
Yes.
Now, I like that
You
because I
like
write
that.
about business storytelling.
You sure do.
But you're the strategic genius, so please, Roger, give it to them.
Well, yes, people want to make strategy an analytical exercise, but what I remind people is that last time I checked, there is no data about the future. So if you're going to crunch data, you're crunching data about the past. Even if you go and collect it, by the time you crunch it, it's already kind of in the past. And Aristotle pointed this out. I'm not the smart guy who pointed that out. He pointed that out 2,500 years ago. It's just the world has ignored him entirely on that point. But what he said is if you're certain the future world will be identical to the past world, right? If I take that glass of water, let go of it, it'll drop, and it'll drop next week because we have a universal force called gravity that operates everywhere. if you're sure you're in that kind of part of the world, analyze past data, right? If you're in the part of the world, which he described as where things can be other than they are, which most of business is, we come up with new products, new ideas, all of those things. He said, don't analyze in order to decide what to do. The father of data analytics said that. He said, you must imagine possibilities and choose the one for which the most compelling argument can be made. So my enthusiasm for possibilities and stories, because he said you have to. He said the highest sort of form of thinking is having a group essentially sitting around a table, and each saying, here's the possibility that I'm going to argue for, right? I think customers would do this, competitors, and so we ought to do this. You can't prove it, because you can't prove anything about the future. And I would say that you would say, based on all of your work, that if you're going to try and make that a compelling argument, what form would it be best and most compelling in? A story, right? It would be in the form of a story. Let me tell you a story about a future that we could create. And I think the best strategists do that. They say, you know, here's a world that we can create. And I think making it as concrete, evocative as possible will help it win against less compelling stories.
I also love the possibilities-based approach that you go through in the book in a wonderfully practical way that people can pretty much copy-paste and put into practice themselves, because not everybody can work with Roger Martin directly. So thank you for the book. I can imagine a lot of people, when they read that straightforward approach to the possibilities-based method that you've pioneered, they think that makes sense. And then they go away and try to do it, but they come up against the conventional wisdom and ways of doing things. So that's because this is a new way to think.
Yes.
So maybe just tease us with one of these new ways to think, because you have a few of these shifts, these mindset shifts.
Well, one would be about how you should think about the structuring of an organization, a corporation. Let's just say you've got a company, and the general idea is the people at the top are responsible for coordinating and controlling everything below. Let's say you have, you know, several layers to the corporation. You're a big corporation, and so the top controls and coordinates, and the bottom, all the way down, has to be responsive to that control and coordination. I don't think that's helpful. The people at the top don't cause customers to choose your product over your competitor's product. It's people down in the bowels of the corporation that are doing that, right?
One of your principles is competition happens at the front line and not at head office.
That's right. People all say, well, Procter & Gamble competes against Unilever, or Nike competes against kind of Reebok. No. In the case of Procter & Gamble, Head & Shoulders competes against Selsun Blue, right? And so what I say is you should reverse the way you think about a company. The folks at the front lines, at the proverbial rock face, are the people who have to win for you to succeed. And if you're a layer above those folks, like if you're the shampoo and conditioner business that sits above Head & Shoulders, your job, your only job, is to help the Head & Shoulders folks sell more Head & Shoulders.
And you have some wonderful examples of why Procter & Gamble therefore sold off very profitable businesses. Roger, thank you so much for giving us a new way to think, a guide to superior management effectiveness. You've been listening to Roger Martin and me, Jyoti Guptara. It's back over to you in the studio with our anchor, Justin Brady. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.